They laughed at him the moment he walked in. It wasn't the kind of laugh you could mistake for a joke. It was the sharp, cutting sound that says you don't belong here. And the bitter truth? Everyone in that courtroom knew exactly why they laughed. Marcus Hill stood tall in his suit, polished shoes clicking against the marble floor as though each step announced his refusal to bow. The silence after their laughter was even worse than the mockery itself. Eyes darted, whispers spread, and from the back of the courtroom came a voice low enough to sound accidental but loud enough to be heard. "What's he doing here, dressed like that?" It didn't matter that Marcus was one of the best defense lawyers in the state. To them, he was still just a black man stepping into a space they thought belonged only to them. Marcus didn't flinch. He had learned long ago that the most dangerous response to prejudice was to let it break your rhythm. His heart, though, betrayed him, beating too fast, like a drum calling up memories he'd buried deep. The smell of the courtroom, the cold wood of the benches, the way uniforms shifted beside him, it all dragged him back to a night 15 years earlier, when he was the one standing on the other side of the law, shackled and silenced. The prosecutor cleared his throat, and the room shifted its attention, but Marcus felt the heat of stares drilling into him. Among them was Officer Bradley, silver-haired now, but with the same wolfish sneer Marcus remembered too well. Bradley had been one of the men who'd shoved him against a wall, slammed cuffs on his wrists, and thrown him into a cell for a crime fabricated from thin air. Bradley's smirk hadn't changed in 15 years. "Counselor Hill," the judge said, voice clipped, "are you ready to proceed?" "Yes, Your Honor," Marcus replied, his voice calm, strong, steady. But inside, the past clawed at him. The irony was almost unbearable. Years ago, these same men had stolen his youth, his reputation, his freedom. And now, they sat comfortably in their uniforms, daring to laugh at him as if he had no right to stand among them. The case at hand was brutal, layered with lies and manipulation. Marcus represented a young black teenager accused of assaulting a white shopkeeper. The evidence was paper-thin, built on assumptions and shaky testimony. Marcus knew too well how these cases ended when no one fought back. He also knew that defending this boy meant clashing head-on with the very system that had once swallowed him whole. As the trial began, Marcus kept his expression stone-like, but his mind was a battlefield. Every time he rose to speak, one of the officers shifted deliberately, making sure Marcus saw their sneer. Every objection he made, Bradley muttered under his breath, "Here we go again." The jury noticed. The judge noticed. Everyone noticed. That was the cruel beauty of racism in plain sight. It was both invisible and blindingly obvious, depending on whether you were its target or its beneficiary. At recess, Marcus walked into the hallway, his breath heavy, his fists clenched. He caught sight of his reflection in the glass doors. For a moment, he saw not the lawyer he had become, but the prisoner he had been. 23 years old, terrified, chained, and powerless. The scar on his wrist from the metal cuffs still burned when he thought about it. He closed his eyes. His mother's voice echoed in his mind. "Marcus, don't let them take your spirit. They can take everything else, but if you let them steal your spirit, you'll never get it back." And so he straightened his tie, lifted his chin, and stepped back into the courtroom. If they wanted to humiliate him, let them try. If they wanted to drag him down to that cage he had once lived in, let them fail again. Marcus Hill had survived the worst they had to give. Today, he wasn't just surviving, was fighting. When he returned to his seat, the teenager he was defending whispered, "They hate you." Marcus leaned closer, lowering his voice so only the boy could hear. "They hated me before I even had a chance to be me. That's why we fight, son. That's why we don't give up." The boy's eyes widened, a glimmer of hope where fear had lived. And in that moment, Marcus realized something he hadn't before. This case wasn't just about clearing the name of one boy. It was about standing in the very place where they had once tried to erase him and declaring that he was still here, stronger, louder, unbroken. The golden light from the courtroom window shifted as the afternoon sun angled lower, striking Marcus across the face. It was almost theatrical, as though fate itself had decided to shine only on him. The officers noticed, and Bradley's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. For the first time all day, Marcus allowed himself the smallest smile. Not of arrogance, but of endurance, of promise. And deep down, he knew this was only the beginning. The cross-examination began like a knife fight, in slow motion. Marcus rose, buttoning his suit jacket with deliberate calm, as though every movement was a shield. The shopkeeper, a middle-aged white man with a shaky voice, sat in the witness box. His story was rehearsed, his tone dripping with false certainty. He pointed to the defendant, a trembling black teenager named Jamal, as though his finger were a weapon. "That's him," the shopkeeper declared. "He's the one who attacked me. I'll never forget his face." Marcus let the words linger in the stale courtroom air. He could feel the jury shift uncomfortably. They had heard this before. They had heard it too many times. He stepped forward slowly, eyes locked on the witness. "You'll never forget his face," Marcus repeated softly, as though tasting the words. "But tell me, sir, how long did the attack last?" The man hesitated. "A minute, maybe less. And it was dark, wasn't it? Streetlight was out, and you were on the ground, weren't you?" Dazed, struggling, scared. The man's mouth opened, closed, then opened again. "Yes, but you're certain you'll never forget the face of the person who attacked you, a stranger you saw for seconds, in the dark, while in shock." The silence that followed was like a drumbeat. The jury leaned in. Even the judge adjusted his glasses. Marcus turned his gaze toward the officers seated in the front row. Bradley shifted in his chair, his jaw tightening. He didn't like this. He didn't like Marcus having control. "Sir," Marcus continued, lowering his voice until it felt like a weight pressing against the man's chest. "Have you ever mistaken one person for another?" The witness stammered, "Well, yes, but so it's possible," Marcus cut in, voice suddenly sharper, "that in that chaotic moment, you made a mistake. A mistake that could ruin a young man's life forever." The man's face reddened. The courtroom buzzed like a hive. The judge called for order, but Marcus didn't need the noise to tell him had landed the blow. Yet he knew better than anyone. In a system built on prejudice, truth alone was not enough. When court adjourned for the day, Marcus packed his files methodically, though his hands trembled beneath the table. He could feel the eyes on him, burning holes through his back. As he turned, Bradley stepped forward, blocking his path with the casual arrogance of someone who thought himself untouchable. Well, Bradley drawled, his voice low but sharp enough to cut. "Look at you. All grown up, playing lawyer now. Never thought I'd see the day." Marcus stared at him, his face calm, his heartbeat furious. "Times change," he said simply. Bradley leaned in, his breath reeking of coffee and contempt. "Not really. A suit doesn't change what you are. Don't forget where you came from." Marcus didn't blink. "I'll never forget." "You made sure of that." For a flicker of a second, Bradley's eyes hardened with recognition. He knew. Marcus saw the memory clicking into place, the ghost of the past resurfacing. Bradley straightened, but the smirk returned quickly, like a mask. "You watch yourself, Hill," he muttered. Then he walked away, leaving the words to rot in the air. Marcus exhaled slowly, his fists clenched inside his pockets. He had dreamed of this moment for years, the confrontation, the recognition, but standing in it felt heavier than he ever imagined. The scars weren't healed. They were just buried, waiting to be unearthed. That night, Marcus sat alone in his office, papers scattered across the desk, the city lights glowing faintly through the window. He should have been preparing for the next day's trial. Instead, he sat frozen, staring at an old photograph tucked in the corner of his bookshelf. It was him at 23, wearing an orange jumpsuit, his eyes hollow, his jaw clenched against despair. His mother had sent him the photo once, saying, "So you never forget what they tried to do to you." He had hated her for it at the time, but now he understood. Forgetting was dangerous. Forgetting meant letting them win twice. His phone buzzed. A message from his mother. "Proud of you. No matter what they say, no matter what they do. Proud." Marcus closed his eyes, letting the words settle. He didn't cry often, but tonight he felt the sting at the back of his throat. Because tomorrow, he wasn't just fighting for Jamal. He was fighting for himself, for every second stolen, for every insult swallowed, for every laugh that echoed when he was powerless to answer. The next morning, the courtroom was colder, tighter. The officers sat like vultures, Bradley among them, his eyes locked on Marcus. Jamal sat beside him, pale and nervous. "Mr. Hill," the judge said, "you may continue your defense." Marcus rose, his voice steady. "Your Honor, the defense would like to call Officer James Bradley to the stand." The courtroom rippled with shock. Bradley froze, then forced a laugh, as though the request were absurd. But the judge nodded. "Officer Bradley, please take the stand." Bradley walked with swagger, his uniform crisp, his eyes darting toward Marcus with venom. He sat, leaned back, and crossed his arms, daring Marcus to challenge him. Marcus stepped closer, his face unreadable. "Officer Bradley, how long have you served in law enforcement?" 25 years, Bradley replied proudly. "And in those 25 years, how many arrests have you made?" "Hundreds." Marcus nodded, as though impressed. "Tell me, officer, do you remember all of them?" Bradley smirked. "Of course not." Marcus tilted his head. "Not even the ones where the suspect was later found innocent." The smirk faltered for just a heartbeat. The courtroom stilled. Marcus's voice cut through the silence. "Do you remember arresting a young man named Marcus Hill?" Bradley's face froze. His jaw tightened. For a long, heavy moment, he said nothing. "Answer the question, officer," the judge ordered. Bradley's throat bobbed. "Yes, I remember." The jury shifted, their eyes darting between the two men. The tension was electric. Marcus leaned in, his voice low but carrying. "And do you remember what he was accused of?" Bradley's eyes flickered. "Armed robbery." "And was he guilty?" Silence. Bradley shifted in his chair, sweat beginning to bead on his temple. "Was he guilty, officer?" Marcus pressed. Finally, Bradley spat the word like poison. "No." The gas that swept the courtroom was like a wave crashing against stone. Marcus stood taller, his eyes burning with controlled fire. "So you admit that you arrested an innocent man. You arrested him, humiliated him, imprisoned him. And now, today, you dare to smirk and sneer as though his life meant nothing." Bradley's face flushed, his composure cracking. "I did my job, your job." Marcus's voice thundered, louder than it had been all trial. "Your job is to protect and serve. Not to profile, not to persecute, not to destroy lives for the color of their skin." The judge's gavel slammed for order, but the damage was done. The jury's eyes were wide, the weight of the revelation sinking in. Jamal looked at Marcus with something close to awe. Bradley sat, fists clenched, face burning. He had walked into that courtroom believing himself untouchable. Now, for the first time, he looked exposed. Marcus turned back to the jury, his voice calm once more. "Ladies and gentlemen, my client is not on trial for his skin color. He is on trial for a crime he did not commit. And today, you've heard from the very officer who once imprisoned an innocent mammy. Ask yourselves this. How many more lives must be broken before we see the pattern for what it is?" The silence that followed was not emptiness, it was transformation. Something had shifted. Something irreversible. And Marcus knew the fight was far from over. But for the first time, the system had been forced to look itself in the mirror. The courtroom erupted into murmurs so loud the judge had to slam the gavel 3 times before the noise subsided. Marcus stood motionless, his chest rising and falling in measured breaths. He didn't need to say more for now. The truth had already detonated like a bomb in the jury's minds. Bradley avoided his gaze, his eyes darting anywhere but toward Marcus. For the first time in years, Marcus saw not the arrogant officer who once held power over him, but a man cornered, his authority stripped away by the very walls he thought protected him. The judge cleared his throat. "Order will be maintained. Counselor Hill, do you have further questions for this witness?" Marcus let the silence stretch. Then he stepped closer, his voice steady but sharp. "Officer Bradley, when you arrested me years ago, did you file a report stating that you found evidence linking me to the crime?" Bradley shifted in his chair. "Yes." "And was that evidence later proven false?" "Yes," Bradley muttered. Marcus turned toward the jury, his tone deliberate. "The false evidence he refers to fabricated, planted, designed to convict a man because of his color, not because of his guilt. That man was me. And now, my client sits in the same chair I once sat in, facing the same system, the same prejudice, the same lies." The words hung like smoke. The jurors' faces tightened, their pens frozen mid-note. Marcus could feel the pulse of history repeating itself, and he refused to let it continue unchecked. "No further questions, Your Honor," Marcus said, his voice final, almost cutting. The judge dismissed Bradley, who walked stiffly from the stand, his swagger gone, shoulders hunched under the weight of exposure. For Marcus, it was not victory, not yet. But it was vindication, a moment he had long imagined yet never thought he would live to see. During the recess, Marcus sat with Jamal in the quiet of the defense room. Jamal's eyes were wide, his voice trembling. They did that to you? They locked you up for nothing? Marcus nodded. 15 years ago. I lost 3 years of my life before the truth came out. Jamal swallowed hard. Then what chance do I have? If they could do that to you, Marcus leaned forward, gripping the boy's shoulders with a firm, grounding strength. Listen to me. They stole years from me, yes. But they didn't steal everything. I fought, I got out, I rebuilt. And I'm standing here now to make sure they don't take a single day from you. Do you understand? You're not alone. Not anymore. Tears glistened in Jamal's eyes, though he blinked them away quickly. I'll fight. I'll stand with you. Marcus felt something stir deep inside him, hope, fragile but fierce. This case wasn't just about defense anymore. It was about defiance. The next day, the prosecution doubled down. They brought in another officer, O'Reilly, who testified with the same hollow certainty as the shopkeeper. He claimed Jamal fit the description of the suspect, claimed he saw him near the scene. But Marcus had prepared for this. He pulled out city surveillance footage showing Jamal blocks away at the time of the crime. The jury leaned forward, their skepticism of the prosecution growing with each contradiction Marcus exposed. By midweek, the trial had become less about Jamal and more about the cracks in the system. Reporters filled the back rows, their pens scratching furiously. The words wrongful imprisonment and racial bias started appearing in headlines. Marcus could feel the tide turning, but tides are dangerous things. They can lift you, or they can drown you. On the fourth day, Bradley returned not as a witness, but as a shadow. He lingered in the hallway, watching Marcus with cold fury. As Marcus walked past, Bradley muttered low enough for only him to hear. You think you've won something? You think dragging my name through the mud makes you righteous? Careful, Hill. Men like you don't get happy endings. Marcus stopped, turning slowly, his eyes hard. Men like me survive. That's more than you can say. For a second, Bradley's mask cracked, his hand twitching as though he wanted to lash out. But he didn't. He couldn't. The law that once protected him was now a weapon against him. Marcus walked away, leaving the officer to stew in his own bitterness. Inside, though, Marcus felt the weight pressing heavier. He knew Bradley's words weren't just threats. They were promises. He was stirring something larger than one case, larger than one courtroom. He was ripping the curtain off a system that thrived in silence, and silence never breaks without a fight. That evening, Marcus visited his mother. She lived in the same modest house she'd raised him in, walls lined with family photos and fading paint. She opened the door with a smile, her eyes tired but warm. Baby, you look like you've been carrying the world on your back, she said, pulling him into a hug. Maybe I have, Marcus admitted, his voice softer than it ever was in court. They sat at the kitchen table, the smell of cornbread lingering in the air. His mother listened as he recounted the trial, the confrontation with Bradley, the boy who reminded him so much of himself. She nodded, her hands folded tight, her eyes shining with both pride and worry. You're doing more than defending that boy, Marcus, she said. You're holding a mirror to them, making them see what they've done. But mirrors cut both ways. Be ready for them to try and shatter it. Marcus reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. I'm ready. I've been ready since the day they put me in chains. The next morning, the final arguments began. The prosecution painted Jamal as a menace, dangerous, reckless, a threat to good citizens. They used words Marcus had heard too many times before, words meant to scare, to dehumanize, to make the jury see not a boy but a stereotype. When it was Marcus's turn, he stood in the center of the courtroom, the golden light from the high window spilling across his face. He let the silence hang until every eye was on him. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, I was once where Jamal sits now. I was once the young black man accused of a crime I did not commit. I was once condemned not by evidence, not by truth, but by prejudice. And I stand before you today as living proof of what happens when the system is blinded by color instead of guided by justice. He turned, his voice rising. Ask yourselves, are you here to preserve a lie, or are you here to protect the truth? Are you here to condemn another young man to a future stolen, or are you here to finally say enough? He gestured toward Jamal, whose eyes glistened with tears. This is not just about one boy. This is about every boy, every man, every person who has ever been told they are guilty before they even open their mouth. And today, you have the power to say, No more. The room was silent, but it wasn't the silence of indifference. It was the silence of hearts shifting, of minds awakening. Marcus's final words were a whisper, yet they carried farther than any shout. Don't let history repeat itself. Don't let injustice win again. Not today. When he sat down, Jamal gripped his hand tightly, whispering, "Thank you." The jury deliberated for hours that felt like lifetimes. Marcus sat in stillness, though inside, storms raged. He thought of his cell, the cold metal, the nights he'd prayed for Simeone to believe him. He thought of Jamal, a child on the edge of that same abyss. And he thought of Bradley, waiting for the system to do what it had always done. At last, the jury returned. The foreman stood, voice steady. "We, the jury, find the defendant not guilty." The words hit like sunlight breaking through a storm. Jamal collapsed into Marcus's arms, sobbing. The courtroom gasped, some in relief, some in fury. The officers shifted uneasily, their smirks gone. Marcus held the boy, his own eyes wet. He had done it. He had stopped the cycle at least for one life. But as he looked up, his gaze met Bradley's. The officer's face was stone, his jaw clenched, his eyes burning with silent rage. Marcus knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The courtroom emptied slowly, the buzz of voices lingering like smoke after a fire. Jamal clung to his mother, tears streaming down her face as she whispered prayers of gratitude. Reporters swarmed near the steps, shouting questions, cameras flashing. Marcus stayed back, standing tall but quiet, his eyes scanning the crowd until they landed on Bradley. The officer stood stiffly near the door, arms crossed, his expression carved from stone. For a moment, their eyes locked. Marcus expected the familiar sneer, but instead he saw something else, something harder, darker. A promise unspoken. Bradley turned and walked away, the echo of his boots sharp against the marble floor. Outside, the sunlight poured golden across the courthouse steps, washing the scene in brilliance. Marcus stepped into it, and for a brief second, he felt the warmth like a benediction, a reminder that truth had broken through. Reporters shoved microphones toward him. "Mr. Hill, how does it feel to win against the odds? Do you believe this verdict will change the way the system handles racial bias? Was this case personal for you?" Marcus raised a hand for silence. Justice is never just about one case. Today, Jamal walks free, and that matters. But let's not fool ourselves, this is not the end of the fight. This system, the same one that once caged me, still cages too many. The verdict today is a victory, but it is also a reminder. We must keep pushing, keep demanding, keep fighting for a day when justice does not depend on the color of your skin. The crowd erupted into cheers and more questions, but Marcus moved through them quietly. His words were not for the cameras. They were for the boy whose life had been saved, and for the countless others whose names would never make the news. That night, Marcus sat alone in his apartment, the city's glow stretching across his window. The adrenaline of the trial had faded, leaving exhaustion in its wake. He poured himself a glass of water, staring at the reflection that stared back from the glass pane. 3 years stolen. 3 years behind bars, branded a criminal, forgotten by the world. He had clawed his way back, but the scars remained. Today's victory did not erase them. It only proved that scars could still fight. The knock at his door startled him. He opened it to find Jamal, his mother, and a few members of the community. They stood holding a simple plaque, handmade, with painted words, for standing when others would fall, for speaking when silence was safer. "Thank you." Jamal hugged him tightly. "You didn't just save me. You showed me I can be more than what they say I am." Marcus felt his throat tighten. "You already were more. You just needed someone to remind you." As the days passed, the case became a symbol. Newspapers called it the Hill Redemption. Civil rights groups rallied, citing it as evidence of systemic failure. But Marcus knew the work was far from over. Each interview, each headline, carried a weight. He wasn't just Marcus Hill the lawyer anymore. He was Marcus Hill, the man who had turned his own wrongful imprisonment into a weapon for justice. But shadows lingered. Late one evening, as Marcus walked to his car, he sensed a prickle of eyes watching. He turned to see Bradley leaning against a lamppost, his face half hidden in shadow. "You embarrassed me," Bradley said, voice low and venomous. "You think you won. But men like me, we don't disappear. The system protects us. Always has." Marcus stepped closer, the golden glow of the streetlight catching his face. The system protected you when you were wrong. That protection is crumbling. And you know it. Bradley's jaw tightened. Be careful, Hill. You dig too deep, you'll find dirt you can't wash off. Marcus met his gaze without flinching. I've lived in dirt. I've drowned in it. But I climbed out. You're the one still buried. For the first time, Bradley had no retort. He shoved off the lamppost and walked away, his figure swallowed by the dark. Marcus stood in the light, chest heaving. He knew Bradley's threat was real, but fear no longer had the power it once did. When you've already survived the fire, the smoke cannot choke you. Weeks turned into months. Marcus continued his work, defending those others ignored. Each case chipped away at the walls that prejudice built. He lost some, won others, but never wavered. And always, he remembered Jamal's words that he had become more than just a lawyer. He had become a symbol. One afternoon, Marcus was invited to speak at a university. The auditorium was packed, students eager, reporters waiting. He stood at the podium, the golden light of late afternoon streaming through the tall windows, bathing him in the same glow that had followed him since the trial. I stand before you not as a hero, Marcus began, but as a man who once sat in chains. I was condemned by lies, imprisoned by prejudice, forgotten by justice. But I refused to let them take my spirit. That refusal is why I stand here today, and it is why I will never stop fighting. Not until no young man or woman fears that their skin will decide their fate in a courtroom. He paused, scanning the crowd. Faces leaned forward, hanging on every word. The officers who once laughed at me in court didn't see the man I was. They saw only the color of my skin. But I tell you this, dignity cannot be erased by chains. Truth cannot be buried by lies. And justice, real justice, cannot be silenced forever. The room erupted in applause, the sound thunderous, unrelenting. Students rose to their feet, clapping until their hands ached. Marcus stood in the golden light, letting it wash over him, not as a savior, but as a survivor who had turned survival into strength. Later, as he walked out into the evening sun, he thought of his mother's words, "Don't let them steal your spirit." He thought of Jamal, free and smiling. He thought even of Bradley, fading into irrelevance as the world slowly shifted. Marcus smiled to himself, not with triumph, but with resolve. The fight would go on. It always would. But now, he carried with him not just the scars of his past, but the power of his present. And under the endless golden sky, Marcus Hill walked forward, not just a lawyer, not just a survivor, but a man who had transformed injustice into a weapon of change. The laughter that once mocked him was gone. In its place, the echo of something greater, a promise that truth, no matter how long buried, would always rise. Thank you for listening. If you find it interesting, please like and subscribe to follow the next stories.